So, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Whitmore. I'm the Senior Russia Analyst for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, author of the Power Vertical blog, and host of the Power Vertical podcast, and I'll be moderating and leading this morning's discussion on Eastern Neighborhood 2017, Times of Turmoil Ahead, where we'll talk about the aspirations of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, who is not represented on this panel, to join European institutions and the geopolitical implications of those aspirations. I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Georgia, Georgi Kvirikishvili, the Foreign Minister of Latvia, Edgars Rinkēvičs, the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Klimkin, State Duma Deputy Vyacheslav Nikonov from the Russian Federation, and Andrea Thompson, National Security Advisor to the Vice President of the United States. So welcome our panelists. To begin the discussion, I want to actually direct the first question at Prime Minister Kvirikishvili and Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin. You've just achieved a great success with the visa liberalization, with the signing of the association agreement. What's next? What's the next goal? Let's go first to Prime Minister Kvirikishvili.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome everybody and thank organizers for this very important event. Security is the cornerstone for everything we do, so it's important to discuss challenges, including upcoming challenges we face, and consolidate against those challenges. We Georgians reached an important milestone. Visa liberalization is an achievement which materializes, brings tangible results for European aspiration of Georgia. For that, we had to implement important reforms, sign association agreement together with deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, and launch a comprehensive overhaul of Georgia's democratic institutions, legislation, and through approximation of the local institutional and legislative standards, we were able to achieve visa liberalization. This is not only free travel for Georgians, but it also has a deep political meaning that Europe opened the door for Georgians. This is a political step from Europe, again, appreciating Georgia's efforts, and of course these efforts were not easy. It all comes at the background of challenging security environment, occupation of Georgia's territories. So it is a big achievement. Now you are asking what's next. Of course, we are preparing for the Eastern Partnership Summit, which will be in Brussels this autumn. And it's important that there are political deliverables at this summit. It is mentioned in the Rome Declaration, which came out spring of this year, March. It says clearly that Europe should stay open for partnerships based on the values and for the countries who are committed to promote these values. So we hope very much that there will be strong political statement reiterating the same spirit. Also, we expect that there will be practical deliverables to work through different instruments to improve connectivity with Europe, to improve the infrastructure in Georgia, to improve education system. And also we think that security cooperation is important. We are all certain that having stable political allies on the eastern flanks of Europe is increasingly important. So CSDP and cooperation under CSDP is increasingly important. Georgia is not only a consumer of security today, but we are a provider of security. We are part of Afghanistan operation, Resolute Support Mission. We are in crisis management operations in Central African Republic and Mali, and we are committed to be present everywhere where a civilized world deems important to engage in the peacekeeping and making regions and countries stable. So we think that these three dimensions create a paradigm which will be very important for upcoming years for Georgia to follow. And for Ukraine, we are very glad about Ukraine's success of visa liberalization and success of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova are absolutely interrelated. So we think that for Eastern Partnership countries to keep consistency on this road and to stay strongly committed to this road is extremely important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. I want to turn to Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin now. President Petro Poroshenko, when the visa liberalization was finalized, said, and I'm quoting, "Ukraine is coming home. Ukraine is coming home to Europe." I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. What does this mean, and what's next for Ukraine in this road home to Europe?
Good morning, everyone. And of course, I can support what Georgi has just said. But I believe, and I really believe, that the whole point about the title of our panel is really misleading, both in the sense of message, but also in the sense of terminology. You know, the point about neighborhood, I very much hope, is over. From the early 90s, the division in Europe was basically set in the sense of division between Europe and the former Soviet Union. This division is over. It won't come back. And the sooner the West, and I mean, you know, the whole transatlantic community gets the point that we are also the indispensable part of the transatlantic community, not only in the sense of, you know, somehow consuming security, like Georgi has just said, but also, you know, providing the security in many senses, the better. And of course, you know, we matter for Russia because without Ukraine, the whole understanding of Russian project, how it's shaping up, I believe, is not there in the sense of legacy, historic legacy, orthodox legacy, whatever. But in the sense of further steps, of course, we have very clear vision. And we should be included in European space and transatlantic space in the sense of security, in the sense of economy. And our next goal in the sense of European integration is very clear. It's about 4 freedoms. We have to embrace 4 freedoms. And on this basis, we have to go in a very consistent way towards the reality to which we actually belong to. And if you see it in historical perspective, if you see it in political and economic perspective, the sooner we gonna stop talking about neighborhood and this division, which is definitely over, so better. And the division now is about values and about commitment to democracy and, of course, rule of law. And this division will be there, and we have to recognize this division.
We have with somebody here, somebody who has gone through this experience that Georgia and Ukraine are going through now. I'm referring, of course, to the Foreign Minister of Latvia, Edgars Rinkēvičs. Foreign Minister Rinkēvičs, what can you offer? What advice can you offer our Ukrainian and our Georgian colleagues and our Moldovan colleagues who are not present on the panel as they go along this road to Europe? You did it. Your Baltic colleagues did it in Estonia and Lithuania. People didn't think you could do it. I remember the attitudes in the early 90s that this was an impossible dream for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to integrate with the European Union. Yet you did it. You said, yes, we can, when everybody said, no, you can't. What advice would you offer to our Georgian and Ukrainian colleagues here?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate our Georgian and Ukrainian friends that visa liberalization that we politically decided at Riga summit 2 years ago finally has come through, and it was a bit kind of disappointing sometimes road that it didn't come earlier, but actually what we have seen is that if Ukraine and Georgia delivers, then also EU must deliver, even if sometimes it's very difficult to get the agreement around currently 28, very soon 27. If you look at our experience, I think that, of course, we had a totally different environment. It was beginning of 90s, it was throughout 90s when There was some kind of historic and moral sense of responsibility on the part of EU. There was a clear perspective for those countries that want to join the EU that they will. We had much, let's say, better situation in our both southern and eastern neighborhood, and EU was not so much struggling with its internal and external issues. So from that point of view, if you ask me that question a couple of years ago, I would be telling a long list of reforms that should be done. Right now, I think that Georgia, Ukraine, other countries of so-called Eastern Partnership, especially those that have signed association agreements, know very well what they should do. My advice would be to have strategic patience. It is absolutely clear that European membership is not going to come in a year, 2, or even 5, or probably 10. However, what we did, particularly taking into account that skepticism that was in many European capitals, we did our best not to be rejected. Because, by the way, in the United States, during our NATO integration, many congressmen were asking, are they like us? Meaning, are their values like US values? The same question was in Europe. So I think that one thing is continue developing country to the point where even the most skeptical EU member state cannot say that you are not qualified. Second, I think that sometimes in the past, and unfortunately there have been some countries, especially Moldova, there were many promises. Before you promise, think if you can deliver. But if you have promised, then deliver. The third, don't blame Brussels. That was the biggest mistake we had. Because you do the reform process for the sake of your country, not for the sake of the Brussels bureaucracy or European bureaucracy. And I think that we are still back home struggling with that kind of situation, that every success is success of national politics, every failure is failure of European politics. And my final point, I think that what we need definitely do, and I know that our Ukrainian and Georgian friends are doing a lot, we still have to struggle to keep European attention, an equal attention also to the Eastern partnership countries, to association partnership countries. I very much agree that while we are very much talking about Article 50, the most famous article of Lisbon Treaty so far, which is about exit, we also have to keep reminding about the Article 49, which is about entry. And that's the job that we should do together. Those who are friends of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, as well as Ukrainians and Georgians and Moldovans should keep reminding about their success and should keep doing the good job back home.
Now, when we talk about the European neighborhood, it's impossible, as much as some would like that term to be relegated to the dustbin of history, it's impossible not to talk about the Russian Federation. And I want to turn now to Vyacheslav Nikonov, a deputy with the in the Russian State Duma, to ask this question, because when I was working and living in Russia throughout the 90s, one of the mantras I would hear from Russian officials, and this was in the very heated period when NATO was enlarging initially, to include the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. And the argument I heard repeatedly from Russian officials at that time was, we don't have a problem with the European Union. We have a problem with NATO. Now, sometime around, I don't know, 2012, 2013, 2014, that line changed. And suddenly it appears, maybe you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but it appears to me, and it appears to many, that Russia now has a problem with the enlargement of the European Union. And I wanted to ask, Vyacheslav Alexeyevich, I wanted to ask you basically point blank, does the Russian Federation have a problem with the European Union enlarging to integrate Russia's neighbors, including Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Actually, the short answer to your question is no. But I would like also to start with putting a question to the audience. What is the largest European city? You would be right if not to count the Asian part of Istanbul. So, what is the largest European city? It's called Moscow. It's called Moscow. Moscow is much bigger than London, and actually that is just to change your perspective a little bit. After this, it would be easier for you to answer the question, what is the largest European country? It's called Russia. But when the word Europe is pronounced in Berlin, in Paris, in London, you don't mean Russia. And I think that was the biggest mistake made after the end of the Cold War, because I think at this time there was a golden opportunity to create the new European architecture, which would embrace everybody, which would embrace Latvia, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia, and creating a new undivided Europe. Common European home, as Comrade Gorbachev used to say, and I used to work for his team. Instead of that, there was another paradigm of expanding institutions which were inherited from the times of the Cold War. And the whole new European construction was without Russia, and in many instances against Russia. So we were treated as outsiders in that process, and what we've got now is the clear result of that decision to keep Russia out. That was one of the functions of NATO from the beginning, and it continues to be so. And that's why we've got quite a few asymmetries. They are in perceptions, but they are also in geopolitics. We're speaking about Eastern Neighborhood. What is Eastern Neighborhood for Russia? For us, it's Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which now includes also India and Pakistan. For us, it's Eurasian Union with Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzia. It's also the Collective Security Organization, which adds Uzbekistan. It's BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which accounts for 44% of the global population. For us, it's APAC. For us, it's East Asia Summits. For us, it's ASEAN Plus. For us, it's ASEAN Regional Forum, and many other things. We have many, many partnerships being so isolated in this world. This is a geographic asymmetry. Speaking in narrow terms about the partnership, the Eastern Partnership in the terms of the European Union, here we have asymmetry in the definition of success. Because for Russia, of course, the definition of success in dealing with the neighbors is to make them as friendly to Russia as possible. The definition of success of many people sitting in this room is how to distance those countries from Russia. And I think these are conflicting goals. We cannot really put this together. We see once after another the instances when the country is saying we are going to become part of NATO, European Union. It is also becoming quite Russophobic. Which goes hand in hand. So for us, we have very mixed feelings about this process of enlargement. You see, do we regard these countries as sovereign? Of course, because that was Russia's deliberate decision to make them sovereign. Do they have the right to enter the European Union? Yes. As for NATO, I would disagree that these arguments about NATO have gone. They're still there, because for us, NATO is not something which is perceived here, because it's a military alliance spending 3/4 of the global defense money, and now planning to expand that figure, which was very well expressed at this conference, is regarding Russia is on top of the enemy list. And which is actually bringing its military machine closer to our borders. Of over 800 American military points of presence, I would put it this way, 400 are around Russian borders. And some of them have nuclear weapons. So for us, it's also a matter of national security, not just for the countries sitting there. And Russia had a long-term experience with dealing with the West, including the combined West, which was not oftentimes very productive and sometimes very destructive. And now about the sovereignty. Russia is one of the two countries with 500 years of sovereign existence. The second being England, which has a less troubled neighborhood. So we have our strong sense of sovereignty, statehood, and we'll have it. We're going to stay as an independent center of power. We're not interested in being integrated anywhere. We are not going to give up our sovereignty to the European Union or NATO, which is inevitable in the European Union on NATO. We're not interested in that, not this time. We accept the right of others to join. At the same time, we understand that European Union is not just a blessing. It's also a responsibility. It's also a acquis communautaire, which I consider not the most exciting reading and not the most business-friendly document. It's that the European Union is the slowest developing part of the world, that the countries which are aspiring for the European Union are actually economically doing not as good as the countries which are not. When the Soviet Union was falling apart, Georgia and Ukraine and Latvia had living standards much higher than in Russia, Belarus, or Kazakhstan. Today, Ukraine has living standard, how we count it, 3 to 5 times lower than in the Russian Federation, and probably 3 times than in Belarus, Kazakhstan. Georgia doing better than Ukraine, but also much lower in GDP per capita than Russia, Belarus, or Kazakhstan. And Latvia, which was doing much better than the Russian Federation, is now doing almost the same as the Russian Federation. So it doesn't mean that even joining the European Union means you're going to develop faster than the Russia, which economy is in shambles because of the sanctions. So, and final point about NATO expansion, NATO, our borders. At some point, I heard from the Russian military, and I think they're right. If U.S. forces, NATO forces, were in the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, Russia is undefendable militarily in case of conflict without using nuclear weapons at the early stage of the conflict. And of course, God bless us from any conflict, especially with the use of some, sophisticated weapons. So, the answer to your question, are we for membership for Georgia and Ukraine in the European Union? Yes. Would we like them?
I think you surprised. I think you just surprised a lot of people, sir.
Yes. We are not against that. If they want, if they wish, they can. Would we like Ukraine and Georgia be part of NATO? The answer is no, but it's their sovereign choice. But you can understand that for Russia, this is a clear and logical position. We do not consider that being good for Russian national interests and very good for European or global security. So we are looking from of course, our angle is somewhat different from what is common in this room, but we are also a sovereign country with our national interests.
I actually want to give Pavel Klimkin the opportunity to very briefly, to respond to that, because I think Mr. Nikonov just surprised a lot of people, and I think you are probably the most surprised person in the room, given that Ukraine is currently in a war with the Russian Federation.
Actually, not really, but I like the point about being for our membership in the European Union, but at the same time saying that it's against Russian national interest. It's somehow, for me, a sort of conundrum,
No, I didn't.
But
say,
not commenting
excuse me,
it.
Pavel, I didn't say that. I said that European Union is okay, but we have some reservations about NATO.
So joining the European Union is already okay. So, two simple points. The first one, in the sense of comment. Russia, European country. I do believe Russia was a European country. And Moscow may be considered in some reality as European city, but it's definitely not anymore, in my understanding, because if you play with geography, it's fine. But for me, the real division is about people, and it's about their values. If you consider Kiev and Moscow now, it's completely two different worlds. So in the sense of reality we have in Russia, Russia is not European reality, definitely not European reality anymore. And this division between the former Soviet Union, like I've said, and between the European Union is not there anymore. The second point, very simple one. Going to Europe for us is a point of going back to Europe, how we understand our history and how we understand our vocation. And it's not a point of saying whether Europe could grow at 2% or 5%. It's simply going to Europe how we understand it. And again, it's not a point of considering whether it's for the Russian national interest or against the Russian national interest. For me, the whole success of Ukraine and Georgia as European and democratic countries is a total negation of the Russian project, how we have it in front of our eyes. I personally believe that the Russian project in the long run is not sustainable. But in the sense of division, in the sense of saying what is European and not European, I believe we need to use our understanding. And our understanding is about something completely different. And probably last, very simple point. If you measure success of Russian policy or whatever by, somehow having sort of neighborhood which is friendly to Russia, so, let's see the whole circle of countries around Russia. Can we have relations based on trust or on any kind of set of values in the foreseeable future with Russia? The answer is definitely no. The answer for Georgia, it's the point for Georgia. So basically, invading Ukraine, Russia made us a sort of fundamental problem for the whole history of Russian project. And it should be clearly understood also in Moscow. But if you talk to the people there, it's not rational, because many people simply can't perceive and see us as Ukrainians and not as a part of the previous reality. And the sooner it's going to stop, it's simply the better. And I believe it's also for Russia, because our success will have sort of transformative effect also for Russia. I very much hope so.
Thank you very much. I want to bring the United States into the.
So respond afterwards.
Yes, yeah. I would plan completely to come back to you, but I also wanted to bring the United States into the conversation here. Andrea Thompson, for the past 3 U.S. administrations, Georgia and Ukraine, the so-called European neighborhood, has been a priority in policy. Not always the top priority, but a priority. With the current administration, there are some concerns in the region that it will not be such a priority for this administration. What could you say to that, please?
Well, first, Brian, good morning, and thank you, and for the group here for the conference. I just want to thank you from the president, from my boss, the vice president, for the opportunity to join. Kind of an interesting point when I look across the room here, and particularly to the gentleman to my right, when you ask about the priorities of this administration. I've had dialogue with 3 of them, and 2 of them have met with my boss and with the president. So I think that's a pretty telling indicator of the importance of Georgia and the Ukraine for President Trump and this administration. We've been very clear on our priorities. We've been steadfast in our relationships with both with Georgia and the Ukraine, that we support their sovereignty and territorial integrity. We've as you've discussed this morning on the gains that they've made. Would laud them as well on the efforts, set by the example early on by the Baltic states on reforms and moving forward, and now recently with both Ukraine and Georgia. With the democratic ideals that we represent globally, represent with the United States, represent with our friends in this room on what can be done when you turn your eye towards democracy, to put that foot forward, independence and ideals and the values that we represent. So absolutely, it's a priority for this administration. Again, we've met with the Vice President. Our first trip out of the gates was to the Munich Security Conference. Now heading to Europe, very important message for the administration on the importance of the relationships. Met with President Poroshenko in that venue. We've had continued calls and engagements, and again, with our friends of Georgia, have had visits in Washington, D.C. and in the Oval Office. So again, this is, I would add as well, the reforms that have made, it's continued, it's a journey. It's a journey that needs to be taken. So we'll continue to partner, we'll continue to be partners in this journey forward with democratic ideals, with the reforms, with their work towards EU and opening the door into NATO. It's not going away, it is definitely one of the top priorities for the administration.
Sticking with you for the moment, Andrea Thompson, I wanted to push on something else that's been kind of out there. This idea of some kind of a grand bargain between the United States and Russia. You see this alluded to in the Russian press all the time, and the implication is some kind of Yalta 2.0, if you will, and that the United States and Russia would make a deal over the heads of the Ukrainians and the Georgians, which could consign Ukraine and Georgia to a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet space. You're smiling, Mr. Nikonov, but you know what I'm talking about. Can you?
Actually not.
How would the United States relate to such a proposal?
Well, the short answer is there is no grand deal. The future of Georgia, the future of Ukraine will be decided by the people of Georgia and the people of Ukraine. With our support, with our assistance, you've seen the relationship in stability and security. We have found historically, when the United States and Europe are peaceful and prosperous, that peace and prosperity extends to the rest of the globe. So there will be no grand bargains, no sphere of influence. Again, we respond to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of both countries. We stand firm with that. You've heard the President and the Vice President speak that we uphold the Minsk Agreement. We uphold that it needs to remove the military footprint in eastern Ukraine, the occupation in Georgia, and restore those borders back to the rightful owners. So there will be no grand bargain from the United States.
Okay, and I know Prime Minister Kritishvili, you wanted to jump in here with a remark.
Yes, very briefly, I will not elaborate about everything what Mr. Nikonov just said. I will only briefly say that Georgia is no longer a post country. I think we need to get rid of these post cliches. We are a country which can be easily called Eastern European country. We are no longer a post-Soviet country. We have one of the lowest corruption, including lower than in many European countries. We have one of the best business climates in the world. We are number 16, according to the World Bank Doing Business ranking. According to the Heritage Foundation, we are 13th freest economy in the world, and our indicators are improving year on year. Our democratic institutions are very strong, and our rule of law is improving every year. And we are absolutely in line with our association agenda and the action plan envisaged by the agenda. So calling, again, supporting Georgia's European aspirations and being against the NATO aspirations are absolutely senseless, because 70%, more than 70% of Georgian population favors NATO integration. More than 80% of Georgia's population favors EU integration. And we are for value-based integration. And we believe that these goals will be fulfilled with consistency and dedication. Now, Russia supports Georgia's EU integration. What is Georgia for Russia? This is the main question. What is the map of Georgia? What is the country they are talking about? So this is the biggest question. And I'm sorry that I'm mentioning about the lower pace of economic growth of the countries, stability of which is undermined by the Russian intervention, sounds very, very sarcastic. I'm sorry to say that.
Mr. Nikonov, would you like to respond to that?
Well, actually, when I was talking about the idea of expanding European Union and NATO, I said that we do not have any objections to the European Union. Actually, the whole issue, I think, was raised, and we insisted on negotiations with Ukraine when it wanted to sign the association agreement with the European Union. For understandable reason, because at this point Russia was the biggest economic partner for Ukraine, and Ukraine was one of the biggest economic partners for the Russian Federation. And so when you open the border with the European Union, you shouldn't negotiate what happens in Russia-Ukraine trade, which is understandable because we were in one customs situation, and Ukraine, after the association agreement, is going in another direction. So we had to renegotiate the trade agreements. And that was perceived as Russia's opposition to Ukraine going to the European Union, and was one of the reasons of the revolution against Yanukovych. You see, we're here also speaking about sovereignty and sovereign rights. The sovereignty of the people is something which I think is really very important. And the new Russia after perestroika, after the end of the Cold War, decided that the nations of Latvia, Ukraine, Georgia have their sovereign rights to become independent states. And that's what happened. That gave birth to 14 new independent states. But then we found out that those artificial borders, administrative borders inside the Soviet Union, did not reflect certain realities and certain ethnic realities, certain historic realities, and then raised the question on whether other people, not just living in the former republics, but in the autonomous republics, have also their right to create their nation states. That was the question for Ossetians, that was the question for Abkhazians, that was the question for the Chechens, that was the question for people for Russians in the Crimea, or for Russians in Eastern Ukraine. And so the question is whether they also have their sovereign right. We know that the international law has a conflicting principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty of the nations to
Well, I think international law was pretty unambiguous about the borders of among the post-Soviet states. I don't think there's much room for interpretation here, sir.
It is quite ambiguous. But when when the United Nations and international law were invented back in 1945, there were only 50 nation states on Earth, and today there are 192 UN members, and each of these states was created as a realization of this principle of national self-determination. So this international law is quite vague in that situation. And so the sovereign rights of the Kosovars, the Chechens, the Ossetians, the Russians in the Crimea.
Are you equating the rights of the Chechens and Russians in Crimea? Did I hear that correctly?
I think what Yeltsin did in Chechnya was a big mistake. And what I'm saying, actually what I'm going to say, if you want to keep your territorial integrity, regard your own domestic policies, because when the Soviet Union had the problems with some republics which are eager to secede, probably the problem was inside the Soviet Union. When Americans decided to become independent from the British Empire, probably there were some problems with the British Empire, not just with French intervention. The same here. If there were problems with Ossetians and Abkhazians in Georgia, probably there was something wrong in Georgia, not just foreign intervention. And now I think the key to solving the situation in Donbass, wherever, try to engage those people. That's something we learned in Chechnya, by the way. Because if you're just fighting there, or you're cutting supplies, which we never did actually in Chechnya, or just having no dialogue with those people, there is no way you can engage them. You cannot, there is no way to bring them back. And this dialogue with the Chechens actually brought to the situation where there is no secession crisis in Chechnya. There are many problems there, but there is no secession crisis in Chechnya because we engaged them. Yeltsin brought them to the Kremlin, you know, to talk to them.
That's a very broad definition of the term engage. I would be one thing I would say, but I mean, sir, it seems to me what you're saying is
In whatever way, engage, just talk to them. Because if you think there is a solution for the situation in Georgia or in Ukraine by talking with Moscow or imposing sanctions on Moscow, that is not going to happen because, well, sanctions do not work for sure. Yesterday I heard that the recipe for making sanctions more effective is making more sanctions, but it doesn't work. The only thing which happens in Russia with the sanctions is it of course makes the life of the ruling party easier, and the nation under pressure. The nation under pressure is uniting around the flag, and that's what's going on and will go on.
You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I want to ask everybody to begin to get their questions ready. I do want to give our panelists a chance to make final comments, and I understand that Foreign Minister Dinkevich would like to make a comment.
Well, thank you very much. I think Paulo said it very clearly, and I can agree with him entirely that if you want to speak about be part of Europe, it's not only a geographic issue, but it's also the issue of values. However, a couple of points. First of all, I think that we all should think about one big question. That was the issue back 20 years ago. I think it's the issue right now. EU, with all its faults, with all its deficiencies, is still very attractive for the Balkan region, for our friends from Georgia and Ukraine. If you look at Russia, actually everyone is running away from the kind of, sphere of influence this country wants to create. I think that brings a very good question. Second, well, I do believe that, I don't want to get into discussion about statistics, but still, back in Latvia, we discuss not about how to reach level of Russia. We are actually discussing how to reach level of Nordic countries. And still, per capita GDP is much higher in Latvia than in Russia, and this is something what I would think that alternative facts are not entirely correct here. Also, the final point, look, I think that there is one mentality issue, and the mentality issue, if we continue speaking about the former Soviet Union countries, then we get a situation where if we continue speak about this event, not about countries that are independent, that have their own right to choose, then we are in trouble. And that's an issue that we become obsessed with when it comes to the press. We always refer to Georgia or Ukraine or whatever country that was part of Soviet Union as former Soviet Republic. We are not referring to the United States as the former British colony or something else. I think this is something that we should be very, very careful. I do believe that there is trouble, and when I'm hearing Mr. Nikonov saying that they don't have objection for Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova becoming part of EU, I had talks with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and he said that Russia actually had quite objection against association agreement because they understood at some point that the Baltic membership in European Union is actually much more dangerous when it comes to economic development, energy dependency, and other things than actually, let's say, our membership into NATO. That was discussion a couple of years ago, and I think that this argument still holds.
I know Mr. Nikonov wants to respond. I want to also give the other panelists a chance to say final words before we go to questions. So very briefly, please.
Well, those boring professors like me, they always bring sources. And this is the World in 2017, published by The Economist. Do you trust this source?
No, because I have three other sources. I have IMF, World Bank,
There are
and
no-
United
Then, of course,
Nations.
there are no questions, yes. If you don't trust the sources, and also the data of the World Bank, of International Monetary Fund, which brings Estonia and Latvia somewhat higher Russia in the exchange rate, GDP, but somewhat lower in the rates of purchasing power parity.
Professor, I also checked my source right now. That's, I think we
Please
can
do,
always,
please do.
we can always argue with different
Absolutely,
statistics.
but well, we understand about statistics, but still, IMF, World Bank, and The Economist, I think those are quite reliable sources, and I usually base my figures on that solid basis.
Okay, I want to give the final opportunity to Prime Minister Kvirikashvili and Foreign Minister Klimkin to make remarks before we go to the audience.
Well, first of all, we are very enthusiastic about the future of Europe. And we are very enthusiastic because of the very clear reason that Georgia is committed to build a value-based partnership with Europe. Of course, European perspective is something we aspire, and we think this is not unrealistic. If we take the current context, it may sound unrealistic. As Edgar said, it may not happen tomorrow, in 2 years, 5 years, but I would disagree that it may not happen in 10 years. I'm sorry, Edgar. But we Georgians are optimistic, and when we look at the headline of this panel, I would also, as Pavlo disagreed, I would also disagree with the panel, because it all depends on us. It all depends on the partnership we build. It depends on the commitment of the national governments to the value-based partnership, and it all depends on abiding very basic principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty. In that case, and if we do not abandon the wider Europe principle, which is again based on the building new partnership based on values and promoting countries committed to that partnerships, I think that we can avoid major challenges in the future. We can mitigate coming risks together again through the partnerships we build. So we Georgians are optimistic about Europe's future, and we are optimistic about our future. And this is something that civilized world should respect. Thank you.
And turning to Foreign Minister Klimkin, actually, I mean, I think one of the things I want to say here, as I listen to the two of you speak, Georgia and Ukraine create a really valuable counter-narrative. I think the European Union was a great debt to both of your countries, because you provide a very powerful counter-narrative to the Euroscepticism that we see inside of much of the European Union. If things are so bad in the EU, why is it that Ukraine and Georgia are dying to get in?
Well, I think that a lot of times Europeans don't appreciate, with due respect to all of them, achievements that have been made in the European Union. This is the longest stable partnership that the countries engaged in the European Union have achieved. I think that the reasons for the skepticism is mostly lie in problems coming from Middle Eastern crisis and the influx of refugees. But I very much hope that, again, as I said, through the partnership of the countries engaged in resolving these conflicts, when these problems will fade away, we very much hope that the wide Europe spirit will revive, and we will be, Georgians, Ukrainians will be part of that spirit.
Foreign Minister Klimkin.
Two very quick points. One, we obviously have fundamental difference with Russia in understanding everything, including, of course, sovereignty. We understand sovereignty as a commitment to democracy and rule of law, and of course following the basic principles of international law. Russia understands something completely different. But basically, we can discuss it for hours. But in the sense of simple example, can you imagine in Kiev, in Lviv, in Stockholm, in Warsaw, people erecting monuments for Stalin and laying flowers there, including the Russian president? It's the nature of division between us and them. And this division is there. It's the fact of life. We could consider it a sort of good fact or bad fact, but it's a fact of life. And we have to live in this reality. But coming back to the title of our panel, and it's my second point, the sooner we stop calling this reality neighborhood, and the whole decision will be taken to include us in the transatlantic community and European space with all kind of efforts behind it, the better. And actually, the point about turmoil is also about us, about Ukrainians, Georgians, and about making and delivering and going forward. So it's about us, and it's about also solidarity, because it what basically works for us in all these 3 years. And the last one, Georgians and of course Ukrainians showed many times that we are ready to fight for our understanding of Ukraine, for our future Ukraine. It was many times, like on the Maidan or now in the occupied Donbass. So it's not about hundreds of people, it's not about thousands of people, it's about thousands and millions. And at the end of the day, it's, I don't like to use this bit of terminology, but still it's a fundamental asset for the whole transatlantic community. People who understand what they've been fighting for and ready to fight further. And we can't simply breach this fundamental division, because this fundamental division is there.
Okay, I want to give Andrea Thompson, you've been watching, and I get a sneaking suspicion you'd like to make some very, very, very brief final remarks, if I'm not mistaken, no?
I'd just like to echo what the foreign minister said. The title of today's discussions with times of turmoil, as we've seen, I would challenge that it should be times of opportunity. We've seen what happens when hard work, with reform, with dedication, with effort for the peoples of the country. Again, we've seen it with the Baltics. We're seeing it now with the time of opportunity. And I think the future is very bright for my two partners to the right, with the continued emphasis, with the continued partnership, that the opportunities for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Georgia, it's an incredible time in our history, and would just like to end with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to go to the audience for questions. I want to ask everybody, A, keep your questions brief. B, make sure they're questions. I want to see a question mark at the end of everything, no speeches. And C, address them to a specific member of the panel. First, I want to go to Katarina Matranova of the European Commission, because we've been talking about the European Union. We have a representative from the Commission here who would like to take the first question from the floor.
Thank you very much, and apologies. It's rather than question, it's going to be a brief comment.
You get a pass on that one.
Thank you. I'm a Deputy Director General in DG for Neighbourhood and Enlargement Negotiations, and it's great to see you on the panel. It's actually not only a very useful counter-narrative. Let's not forget that on Maidan and in the war that continues, people of Ukraine are actually dying for Europe, and I'm not sure we actually appreciate that sufficiently. I have 3 brief remarks. One is, you talked, Foreign Minister, about strategic patience. I like the framing, and I think what we owe to the countries of Eastern Partnership is to provide strategic assistance and really try to help the reforms and help the reformers in the countries. And this is how we are looking at the Eastern Partnership Summit in November, where we are planning concrete deliverables. to help the process along. Second point, Mr. Nikonov, I just would like to, I understand your point about asymmetry of interests in European neighborhood from the point of Russia and the EU. I just would like to clarify a little bit. It is not what we are trying to do in the East is to make the countries go as far away from Russia. In fact, the EU held trilateral talks, many rounds with you and Ukraine when Ukraine was about to enter into the DCFTA. Those failed, as you know. So what we are trying to do is support the reforms in the country, support the processes, and one, unfortunately, unifying theme around the neighborhood is the open or frozen conflicts and the hybrid attacks that they are under. So I think it's not us trying to take them away from you or push them away from you. It's rather reacting to the reality. And the third brief point on the question of GDP and the Economist and the World Bank and IMF, there is a very big difference between countries based on commodity, oil and gas riches, in the former Soviet Union and those that don't. And I think that the dynamism you see in the economy of Georgia is on the upward trend rather than what you have in Russia. And the reforms that Ukraine, the fundamental reforms that they have done in the banking, energy sector, public procurement, etc., speak well for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katerina. And I want to say, Katerina got a pass. Being a member of the commission has its privileges, nobody else does. Questions, please, briefly, the gentleman here.
So, Julian Fota from Romania. I think the real elephant in the room is not Russia, it's China, because geopolitics is changing fast due to globalization. So my first question is, how do you see increased presence of China in our region? Because we don't talk about them enough, but they are coming. And the second question for our American friend, do you have also Republic of Moldova on your list, although they are not in the panel? They are among the group with Georgia and Ukraine. Thank you.
Can you repeat the
Can you repeat the first question?
It's about China.
About China.
Yes, I think the real elephant in the room is
China.
China. They increased their presence in Central and Eastern Europe, which was not the case in the past, maybe excepting 600 years ago. And this is a factor who is changing the relations.
Okay, Moscow to respond to that.
Well, of course I can speak about China, but when you say Central and Eastern Europe, you also mean Russia? Or I sometimes is missing the terminology here, because what is Russia in your definition? It's Far Eastern Europe, it's not Europe, or whatever. But first of all, of course, I would like to react to what Mr. Klimkin had to say about erecting Stalin's monuments and putting flowers to those monuments. Of course, this is a known fact. It has never happened. And actually the difference, there are some really fundamental differences in perceptions and in values between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, one of the facts is that many central streets in the cities of Ukraine have already been renamed after the Nazi criminals, after people who are responsible for deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, Poles, Slovaks, Russians, Jews. We know what the SS division Galichina was doing. And the veterans are marching on the streets of Kiev. So that is really one of the basic fundamental differences. The other differences being, of course, Russia would never ban TV channels. Russia would never ban websites.
I think that
Russia will never ban.
I think that's certainly subject to debate.
Russian will never ban books.
But I did want to give.
And we do have 4 million Ukrainians as guest workers in Russia. So that's the fundamental difference.
I know.
As for China, China is definitely one of the leading economic forces in the world. For us, it's both a challenge and the opportunity, and I think it's more of China as more of an opportunity. it is an opportunity because it is the fastest growing country in the world. Its economy, purchasing power parity-wise, is already bigger than the US. When you are talking about diversifying the sources of getting energy, mainly running away from Russian energy sphere, China is very cooperative in that area. Russia is in that area. Russia is definitely interested also in diversifying the routes of transportation and has already become the #1 source of energy for China. Recently, Mr. Putin was in Beijing for the big summit of more than 60 leaders, which are working on the Silk Road projects, which would be worth trillions of euros, dollars, whatever. They are about building infrastructure in the whole Eurasia. So in my mind, China, of course, is a growing power, but it is the main trade partner for all countries present here. And it is also the driving force of growth in the world. Last year, it accounted for 37% of the global growth. So it's inevitable big power.
Now, I know the gentleman also directed a question to Andrea Thompson. I want to give you a chance to respond to the question.
I believe the question was, do we support also the Moldova, correct?
Yes.
Yes, so the brief answer is yes, we would encourage continued reform. We've seen what happens when you put forth that effort. So yes, we absolutely support the continued reform and efforts of Moldova.
Okay, and the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. Ms. Thompson, thank you for bringing up the May 10th meeting between Vice President Pence and Foreign Minister Klimkin here. It occurred the same day as President Trump's meeting with Sergei Lavrov. Some of us in the press noticed some discontinuity in some of the media messaging about those series of meetings. For instance, the press readout of the meeting between Pence and Klimkin says that the Vice President emphasized unwavering U.S. support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity. There is no presidential readout of the meeting with Klimkin, but there is a New York Times report that says Mr. Trump played down his personal concern about the fighting in Ukraine to Sergei Lavrov in that meeting that day, and that according to the official, the president said American critics cared about the issue and asked the Russians to help resolve the dispute. So is there a discontinuity between the vice president's office and the president's office on the need for strong sanctions and territorial integrity in Ukraine? And more to the point, how do you know?
Well, there is no gap between the president and the vice president. Again, I go back to my initial message on when the vice president spoke in Munich shortly after the inauguration on our support to Ukraine, to the support to Minsk. That said, we've had dialogue with Russia at many levels. Talked primarily with trying to find a resolution in Syria. So there are areas where we do need dialogue. And again, the immediate discussion had to do with Syria. How do I know? I was in the room with the foreign minister, the president, and the vice president. I was not in the room with the president and the Russian counterparts. But I know, I'm in with them every day, and I know that they are start their mornings and end their days together, both the president and the vice president. They're speaking with one voice, and so yes, I've been very consistent on that. Consistent again, the president was consistent during his recent trip in Europe about the importance of our relationships in NATO, with the EU and its engagements there, and again on our messaging with Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you. Gentleman in the glasses here.
Briefly,
please.
Milo Jones. All countries have strengths and weaknesses. What weakness of the Russian Federation do you, as its neighbors, find most worrisome for your future?
Admirably succinct, and can you?
Me?
Whom was the question directed to?
Definitely not to me. Though I can dwell on that. I have my list of weaknesses, but probably they will not coincide.
Why don't we begin with Foreign Minister Edgars and move
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that one very troubling issue that I would definitely put is that I'm a bit afraid that the way how, if you follow Russian internal developments, the way how the country is developing currently, it's the country that is to some extent closing down. We had situation when Russia tried to be open society. Now we see that, with all due respect, but there is such a very nice authority called Roskomnadzor, which is censoring not only websites but also Twitter accounts and social media. And also there have been some cases about foreign media, about foreign agents. I have a feeling that to some extent, if since 1953, with all the history of Soviet Union, after death of Stalin, Russia was kind of trying to become part of international system. There were attempts to do it throughout around 2000, and I think that the turning point to some extent was the 2008 and what happened between Russia and Georgia when international principles and norms were not anymore observed. So from that point of view, I'm afraid that the biggest weakness is that Russia is moving away from international norms, values, and law, and actually considering that as a norm. So from that point of view, that's the biggest threat. And when I'm talking about closing down, I think that to some extent the whole economic development, not actually since 2014, since imposing sanctions, but before, was not on structural reforming of Russian economy, but just spending, spending, and spending. And as a close neighbors, by the way, we are not very happy with the way how things are developing. It would be in our greatest interest to have Russia as a stable partner in the international relations and as a good neighbor. And despite all the facts that are not very good at this time, we still try to keep some kind of engagement and dialogue on some of issues that neighboring countries are having. But I have this feeling that by ignoring and actually violating international norms and also to some extent closing down mentally and also economically, it's quite a challenge.
So how does it look from Tbilisi, Mr. Prime Minister?
Well, I think that the biggest weakness is some kind of a fear to make this major shift to concentrate inward on the economic development and on solving internal problems, and not to follow this constant trend of distracting people's attention somewhere else. I think this is the biggest, the major transformation that Russia should undergo tomorrow or sometime after this. And I think there is a clear fear to make that shift. And I think this is a complex, the whole complex of issues, not to make enemies out of your neighbors. This is, and as Edgar said, we all are naturally and logically interested to have a stable, democratic neighbor. There is no doubt about it. But this partnership should be based on the cornerstone, baseline principle of respecting territorial integrity and sovereign decisions of nations who are your neighbors.
And the view from Kyiv, Mr. Prime Minister.
Actually, I do see a couple of weaknesses in and around Russian system, but I would prefer to mention just 3 of them. not going deeper. One is definitely the nature of the Russian system, rigid and vertical, and at the end of the day, any kind of important decision in the system is about judgment of one person, the Russian president. So it's definitely about his judgment, his personal judgment. Second, it's of course the necessity for quite profound reforms, whether they are going to be embraced before the presidential elections or after. But it's about economy, but it's also about society. Just cast a look on the Russian demography. And of course, delivering on reforms would need additional push of mobilization for the Russian society, and it's always crazy dangerous, as you know. And the third point is a sort of divergent reality in Russia because of propaganda. You know, some people a couple of years ago told me, look, Pavlo, it's about switching off the TV, and maybe the Russian mentality will get back to normal in a couple of days or weeks. I believe now, after all of this propaganda, it's simply not going to get back. So switching off the TV does not mean that this virtual reality would get back to sort of real reality. So I would mention just three of them.
Okay, thank you very much. And I believe the microphone is over here. Yes. And
Davila Shukita, Eastern Europe Studies Center, a very content citizen, by the way, of EU, coming from Lithuania and Baltic states, of course. My quick question, basically, over past days we've been discussing multi-speed Europe or multi-speed EU. Would you agree that now we have multi-speed EAP? This question, of course, to EAP colleagues. And while answering, I would appreciate if you could actually elaborate how useful you find the EAP initiative, and especially while cooperating not only with EU counterparts, but among themselves. Like, do you call to Tbilisi from Kiev to, ask how did you do this reform, and, to share experiences? And a quick kind of, remark to our Russian counterpart. Thank you for coming here. It's so yes, we agree. I think everyone would agree that NATO is expanding by incorporating new members, right? We, of course, are increasing our troop numbers and military equipment by our external borders, but we never cross our borders. We stay within our borders, not like Russia. So in short, what are you afraid of? Thank you.
okay, thank you very much for that question. As we're running short on time, I want to ask not only our questioners to be brief, but also our distinguished panelists to be brief. Brevity, after all, is the soul of wit. I want to ask, I guess, Foreign Minister Rinkevich, I think you might tackle the first question, and Mr. Nikonov the second.
Very, very quickly, the answer about Eastern Partnership is very clear. Yes, we have very flexible and individual Eastern Partnership program, and I believe that those countries that have signed association agreements, all three have also visa liberalization, are the countries that are having their own clear vision what they want to achieve. What we could do as EU still, we should expand and deepen sectoral cooperation in many fields, and I believe also that the real summit deliverable in November would be if we decide that the more resources, the more assistance is being given to countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, because they have already achieved a lot and they should get more assistance. So to some extent, I wouldn't call it multi-speed Eastern Partnership. I would call it, as we do it in the European slang, flexible, individual, tailored partnership.
Mr. Nikonov, your response to the question.
So what are we afraid from us? It all depends, of course, on the definition of us. Us is the West, the United West. We have some history of crossing borders. The most distinguished cases, of course, of United Europe crossing our borders were Napoleon and Hitler. As for the United States, it's crossed the borders of militarily of 50 countries during last century, some of them not once. As of NATO, US, and coalition of the willing, I can name quite a few countries which borders of which were crossed. Yugoslavia, for example, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Syria, or Libya. There were certain instances of crossing borders, not just what are we afraid? Yeah. I think it's quite natural to be aware of, as I mentioned, 400 points of military presence at your border, some of them with nuclear weapons, while Russia has not a single military base installation in the Western Hemisphere. So we have some historic reasons to believe that the West is not just a force on the side of the good. we have quite a strong military infrastructure which is increasing on our borders. We are regarded in all the strategic documents of the US government and NATO as enemy number one. So just put you in our shoes, and would you perceive it as a problem or just as a blessing? Of course, it is a problem. And of course, what we are afraid of now, that there is no dialogue, because the formula we hear is defense deterrence, of course, okay, we've got it, but it is also dialogue. As I understand English, dialogue is about talking to each other. But actually, every American official who talks to a Russian official is fired. We now know how to fire officials we do not like in Washington. Just Russian ambassador should pick up the phone, make a call, and say wrong number, and he'll be out. You know, I met every single American ambassador, not once, since the 1970s, since I was in American studies. As a student of America, I was there at the embassy many times. I had lunches, dinners, breakfast with everybody. You know, Sandy Vershbow is here, and we met many times in many instances. Nobody in Russia ever suffered after speaking with the US ambassador. You know, what worries me actually is something which was described in one of the books
I'm thinking
written by Richard Hofstadter, which
I think
was called The
abuse my
Paranoid
position as the
Style
moderator here.
in American
I'm
Politics.
going to abuse my position as the moderator
Please
here
do.
and come in. I think I want to first give Andrea Thompson an opportunity to respond to that, and as well as Foreign Minister Klimkin made an indication. And we have questions I really do want to get to from the audience. We have 15 minutes to go, so I want to implore everybody, please be brief.
Yeah, actually, for the good of this group and actually the topic, and to get back to some substantive discussion, I'd actually defer to Foreign Minister Klimkin and get the discussion back on track. Thank you.
I wanted to react quickly about to the point about multi-speed and the Eastern Partnership. For me, it's really misleading because multi-speed is about having the same goal and getting to this goal, probably having different tools and different way of how to reach it. Eastern Partnership is about something completely different. It's about framework and it's about networking. So it's not about multi-speed at all. So we have different political goals. We have different locations. So it's not about simply kind of multi-speed reality here. So framework, networking.
Okay, I'm also going to abuse my position as the moderator to bring to correct an injustice, because I think we've been talking a lot about Moldova. We have a representative of Moldova that I see in the audience, Elena Marzac. I'd like you to jump in here, actually.
Elena Marzac, Republic of Moldova. I suppose that I'm the only representative here of the Republic of Moldova. It's a pity that our high representative are not here. And the panel is quite challenging for me as the representative of civil society. Of course, Moldova used to be a success story of this partnership. And now we're at the critical moment, and the decision now is very important. Even in 2015, the election showed that the pro-European parties are supported by our citizens. Now we have the lack of societal cohesion, and half of the population is pro-Russians, and we have a pro-Russian president. And it's due to our lack of reforms, due to the theft of the million, but it's because of the presence of Russian media, and the propaganda is everywhere, and we have this Russian president, and we have an hysteria in our society against NATO and the European Union. Of course, it's more a comment from my side, but the question to the representative of Georgia and Ukraine, as you are the high representative of your countries, how you communicate with your population, how do you attract the population that's against this European and NATO membership? What kind of communication strategy do you have?
Very good question, actually.
Well, we'll have a comprehensive program of strategic communication. We have a special ministry for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. He's here present in this room. And we have conducted intense communication campaign throughout the regions among different parts of our society, minorities, also church representatives. So we are quite successful in countering anti-European and anti-Western propaganda.
For Mr. Forman.
Look, I actually don't believe in counter-propaganda. I believe in our own narrative, in our own powerful narrative. And what is happening, what has been happening in Ukraine with the occupation of Crimea and with the occupation of Donbass actually supports our narrative very much. Before the Russian aggression, we had just 18% of Ukrainians fully supporting NATO membership. Now it's 65. It's a completely different reality in the sense of perception, and this perception is not gonna fade in away simple. But my if you like advice in the sense of your communication strategy, although our Russian panelists somehow criticize me for that, simply shut off all the Russian channels with the whole scrap and propaganda. Very simple. And very, very simple. And if you analyze what is going on with whole stories, somehow about Ukraine, about fascist, about junta in Ukraine, and the same stories about Moldova in many times, you will have clear. You will make a real difference. And now I believe it's about Moldovan national security, really. So it's my serious advice.
Yeah, I think we probably have time to get to at least one question here. Just leave brief questions, brief answers, please. We're really bumping against the clock now. The lady in the front.
Thank you. Yana Kubzova, I work at Rasmussen Global. I have a very brief question to Mr. Nikonov. You talked about Georgia and Ukraine as being sovereign countries. But in fact, at least as I understand it, what you described was a limited sovereignty. You can join the EU, but you shouldn't join the NATO. We don't think the EU is good for you anyway. What needs to change in Russia, in Ukraine or Georgia or in the EU for Russia to see these countries as sovereign as Russia?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'd like to react to the answers about how to stop Russian propaganda. So the answers are two. First, create your own propaganda machine, or shut down Russian channels. And my question is, who is living in the free world, actually? Because we are not cutting any channels of information. We have CNN, BBC, Deutsche Welle in every package, in every television. We do not shut internet sites. We don't, except for those who are, who are for suicidal behavior. Actually, today, my recommendation would be don't cut information from outside, because it's harmful for your country. You will get less information. So if you want to live in the free world, please do. This is also the world of free information. As for I would answer the question about what should change for Russia to regard Ukraine and Georgia as sovereign countries. We do regard Ukraine and Georgia as sovereign countries. It does not mean that Russia has no say on what it likes and what it not like. We say this is something which coincides with Russian national interests, something which does not coincide their national interests, but if it is the choice, sovereign choice of the people of Ukraine, sovereign choice of the people of Georgia, it's a sovereign choice. As well as there is a sovereign choice of 96% of voters of the Crimea to become part of Russia. There is a sovereign choice
let's bring
of
George-
some
let's bring-
other
let's bring Georgia in here
parts
as we're
of
talking about
other,
the sovereign choice.
there is sovereign choice of Abkhazians. You know, they also have the right to sovereign choices. So I think what needs to change is for
Mr.
the
Nikonov,
European
please,
Union
let's let
and for
the Prime
those
Minister
countries
respond
to
this.
recognize the possibility for the
Mr.
people
Nikonov.
to make their sovereign choices.
Mr. Prime Minister.
I think my answer to promote the values you believe throughout the country was misinterpreted into propaganda, counter-propaganda. This is not counter-propaganda. This is promoting the values the whole majority of country believes and promoting the results we have been achieving during all these years. This was a very brief remark.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we are truly bumping up against the end because we must finish on time because the next panel will feature not only the Prime Minister of our host country, Slovakia, but the Prime Minister of the neighboring country, the Czech Republic. So I'm going to wrap it up right now. Ladies and gentlemen, you surely know by now that refreshments are available just outside the foyer. But please remind you that you should be back in your seats at 12:30 for the final session of GlobSec 2017, featuring, as I said, two Prime Ministers, the Prime Minister of our host country, Slovakia, and the neighboring country, the Czech Republic. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.